Whoops. Okay, so we're talking about shaders. So in an old video game, when you didn't have like, sophisticated GPU processing stuff, you would use a skybox or a cube map. Actually, skybox is probably a, so cube map is what all of these things are, but a skybox is specifically one for a sky. And so what that would do is it would take a big picture of the sky and it would break it up into these different cubes, and then you'd make like a gigantic cube that covers your whole scene, and then that's what the player would see when they looked up. They would see this top part. When they looked to the left, they'd see this left image. So it's just like a really, really big image, but it doesn't look very realistic because it doesn't actually react to like movement, and you can't, change things over time. And so a better, more sophisticated way of drawing the sky is using a shader. So this is the Three.js Sky Shader. There's a lot of different versions of this for different game engines and stuff like that. But you can see it's doing something kind of similar. It's creating this gradient into the hemisphere, and then that has this like little sun, and then the sky gets more blue as you look up. And you can control different things. So we can control, I don't know what turbidity means, but we can see what the differences are. We control these different values to get different effects. So we can get different types of skies, different times of day, different things. And this is based on like the actual physical properties of the sky. So we can see like the elevation of the sun makes things brighter. We can change, this value is called the azimuth, but it's just like where the sun is in the sky, so we can rotate it around. And then the level of exposure. And so what this is doing is, instead of applying an image to this like kind of area surrounding our scene, it's applying a shader to the area surrounding our scene. So everywhere we look is being computed by this shader rather than just using a static image to decide what pixels to draw. And so writing shaders is really complex, and it's not something that's in the scope of this class. Although if it's something you're interested in, it's pretty fun, and I can point you to some resources for it. But since we talked about adding a sky, and there's a good shader for this, it's a good way to kind of show how this works. So let's add this sky into our scene, and that's what we're going to be working on today. So I'm going to click on the code here and just take a look. It's not too crazy. It's really just a few lines of code, but we're just going to add it into the scene. So I'm going to go back to my demo project, and I'm going to open the preview window. So I have that open. And I'm going to open up the console as well. Okay, so I added this kind of like goofy stand-in CSS sky, which actually doesn't look bad, but you can tell it looks always the same. No matter where I rotate, the gradient is the same thing. So we're going to replace that with our own sky in Three.js now. So let's collapse all these functions, and I guess I'll put this in the lighting function because it's kind of most closely related to lighting. But we need to add a script here. So let's find the script that we need to add. So the first thing I'm going to do if I want to add a new component is find the script. So this is in Three /addons/objects/sky.js. So that's where I can find it. Oh, but it doesn't have a link. So we have to go to the GitHub. So let's go to Three.js, click on the GitHub page. Actually, I want to leave this open, so I'm just going to Google Three.js GitHub. And then I can find this in examples, and it's under add-ons, which I don't see here. So let's see, Three add-ons objects sky. Okay, let's go back to Three.js. Is there an add-ons folder? Huh. There's no add-ons folder. Maybe this isn't build? No. Source? Okay, so I can't find it in here, so let's just look for it. So I'm just going to look for sky.js, in this repository. And let's see. Huh. Oh, this says merged sky shader. Huh. Because these are just the examples I was just looking at. That's weird. Okay, let's try examples again. Um, let's see, maybe it's in JS. Objects, sky, there we go. Okay, for some reason this is in a different place now, so I guess it's that they just haven't updated that example. But anyway, here's the code I want, sky.js. So let's look at the raw file and let's save this. I'm just going to put it in downloads and then I'm going to upload it over here. So you could also just link to it on the GitHub, but I like to have my files in here. So I'm just going to click add a file and go to upload a file and find my downloads folder. There's my sky.js. I'm going to click open. And then I want to put this in my JS folder. So I'm just going to rename and just put JS at the beginning. So I'll say js/sky.js. And so now I have my sky.js with my orbit controls. So that's all in there. And I just have to remember to add it to my index.html. So I'm just going to copy the orbit control script and paste and rename this sky.js. So now I should be able to load the sky in. So I'm going to go back to script.js and I might want to like animate the sky and stuff like that. So I'm going to make it a global variable. So if I want to animate it, I can change things later. So I'm going to say let sky up here in my global variables. And then I'll initialize it in a lighting function since it's kind of related. So we'll put sky here. And then for this, I just have to add in the code. It's really not that complicated. So I'm just going to go ahead with these lines. So it says add sky. I'm just going to copy this bit. And most of the rest of this code has to do with, in the example, like changing stuff. So I'm just going to say sky equals new sky. And for this one, remember, I have to add in three.sky. A lot of these examples are written using the modular JavaScript style, but we are using the normal JavaScript style, so we have to put 3 in front of everything. But other than that, the rest of this should work. I don't know what scalar means. We should play around with that and see what it changes. But then I'm just going to say scene.addSky. And then I probably want to, well, let's see what happens. We may need to turn off the renderer alpha, but let's just see what happens when we reload the scene first. Okay, so the scene is just black. So we must have, there's some other code that we have to add in there. Let's turn off the alpha just in case that's the issue. So I'm going to go to the renderer and take that alpha is true out. And then try that again. Okay. So I don't have any errors, but I don't have a sky. So let's log the sky, make sure it's working, and then we'll look at the rest of the code. So I'll say console.log sky. Okay, so we do see the sky, and it looks okay. So let's look through the rest of the code and see what we're missing. So there's also this sun thing. I don't know if we need that, but let's go ahead and add it in. So we have sun equals new 3.vector3. So that's just like a position. I'm going to add it to my global variables as well. So I'll say let sky comma sun. And okay, so now we have our sun set up. So let's see, what else do they do in here? So then these are like the defaults, but this is really just for like changing the GUI. Oh, but then they run this, so we probably need to, but these should all be defaults. I wonder, we probably need to set this. Sun position.copy sun. Oh, there we go. Okay. So yeah, we need to do some of this stuff. So we don't actually have to set up the GUI stuff. That's like in the examples. If you ever take an example that has a bunch of code that says stuff about the GUI, what they're referring to is this thing, which allows you to make changes so you can see the different parameters, what happens when you change them. But we obviously don't need these in our scene. We just need to know how to implement them. Um, so I'm just going to go through, let's see if there's anything else in here that we missed. Okay, init sky gets called down here. Okay. So I think the only thing that we really need to do is set this sun value. Um, but let's just log some of this stuff and just see what it says. So what it's doing is changing the uniforms. Uniforms are like parameters for the shader, actually. So let's see what that says. So let's log sky.material.uniforms. And let's see what that says. See, I think what we're missing is that we have to tell the sky where the sun is. So these are all the uniforms, and they have default values, and they look fine. Here's the sun position. Let's see if we change this to like 100. There we go. That's what we're missing, is that we don't have a sun position, so it's just like black. But this is what we need to change. Okay, so now we know what the problem is. And the way that we set the sun position is based on this math, which is a little tricky, but I think we can figure this out. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it back into my code, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so the first thing that's happening is we're getting the elevation of the sun. And so what's happening here, this is like more complicated than it really needs to be, but basically, this is just creating an angle. And so this part here, three.mathutils.degree to radians, this is changing from like math.pi, like using that for rotation, to like using 360 as your basic way of doing rotation. So it makes it a little bit easier to read. We're basically saying 90, whatever, minus whatever we want the elevation to be. I'm just going to copy the default elevation here, which is just 2. So it's essentially just 90, but I'll put that in here. So I'll say 2. And maybe we can make a variable for that. So let's say let elevation equal 2, and then I'll put elevation in here, so we can change that if we want to. And then the next part is doing the same thing, except with the azimuth, which is the rotation. So let's use their default of 180. So we'll say let azimuth equal 180, and then we'll take this out and just leave the azimuth in there. And so that's going to set the rotation of the sun based on the elevation and the rotation that we want. And so when we set the rotation, it's going to give us a position, and then we're just copying that position to our shader, which looks kind of weird, but we can rewrite this as just sky.material.uniforms.sun position. And I think this will work. Let's reload it. There we go. Now we have our nice sky, and now we can change the elevation or the rotation based on those values. It does look a little bit different. I guess they have different defaults for these values here. So you could change those as well, because this looks like really like blown out. But let's try changing the elevation a little bit. Let's change the elevation to like 20. See how that looks. Okay, see now it's much brighter because the sky is higher, or the sun is higher up in the sky. And yeah, it's really, really blown out. So let's bring that in a little bit. So let's see what those values might be. Okay, so that's, I think, the whatever MEI coefficient is and directional. So we need to bring those down. So let's just take whatever their defaults are and plug them in. So I'm just going to copy this and go back here. And here's their defaults. And so I just have to plug in the uniforms here. So I'm going to say sky dot material dot uniforms dot MEI coefficient. And then I think to set this, I have to set the value. So I'll say dot value equals 0.05. And then we can do the same thing here. Let's copy that and throw that in there. So that's 0.7. Let's see if this gives us a slightly more reasonable. Okay, it's still quite bright. Um, let's see. Let's look at our. Okay, so it did set these values. What are their other defaults? Rally 3, turbidity 10. Okay, rally value, let's see if we change this to 3. And turbidity, I don't really know what these things mean. I'm sure you could look them up. But let's see what happens if I just change them. It doesn't fix anything. Let's see, elevation. Oh, and then exposure. That might be, what's the exposure value? I don't actually see that on here. Let's look at the code and see. Oh, that's the renderer. Oh, interesting. Okay, so this is actually having to do with the renderer, not the sky itself. So it's changing the exposure to tone mapping exposure. So let's look up what that actually means. So let's go to Three.js.org, and then I think after that we'll be done. So let's look at the renderer, and let's look up tone mapping. Okay, so this is used to approximate the appearance of high dynamic range on the low dynamic range medium of standard compute. Oh, so this is like has to do with how it thinks that color should be displayed on a computer. So I don't know if this is actually going to fix anything, but let's give it a try. So I'm just going to copy this here and paste it into my setup. So we want the renderer.toneMappingExposure to equal to let's see, what do they have it for to start? They have it at 0.5. Okay, so let's try 0.5. Yeah, that looks pretty much the same. So I'm not exactly sure what else to do here, but let's put the elevation back down. So our sun looks a little weird, but at least we still have a sky, and we can continue trying to play around with those values until we get something that looks like what we want. But I think that's good enough for now. But yeah, there's our sun. I'll play around with this a little more, see if I can get it to look more like the example. But I think this is our basic idea. So I'll put a link to this. This is the same link. I just added this into the same example, but I'll put a link to this in the chat as usual for you guys to take a look at if you want to add a sky into your scene. And then actually, I never talked about the schedule. Let's talk about the schedule a little bit. I meant to talk about that earlier. And then we'll have a little bit of time for you guys to work on stuff if you want. So yeah, we're finishing up assignment one that's due today. We're looking at shaders and adding the sky. What we're going to do tomorrow is talk about loading external models into your scene. So this will be useful if you do 3D modeling on your own, you'll be able to add models that you create, or you can add models that you would find on the internet. So if you go to like sites like Sketchfab, and you can find uh, open source or Creative Commons 3D models. Let's go to explore. I mean, there's a million websites like this. We'll look at a few of them tomorrow. But yeah, you can find models. There's a lot that are, that you don't have to pay for. Let's look at Creative Commons. Let's just look at CC0. Oh, there's no CC0. Well, okay, let's look at. Okay, so yeah, you can find models. It's a lot of cars. Uh, but there's some trees, clouds, there's some cool stuff in here. So what we'll look at is how do I get a model that I find online or that I create myself through Blender or through um, Cinema 4D or something like that. How do I get that into my web Three.js project? So that's what we are going to do tomorrow. We have class tomorrow because of the weird schedule. And then next week, we're going to add controls. And next week, we only have class on Monday. So I think week 5 is going to stretch a little bit, but that's okay. We're going to look at how to add controls. And what we'll do is we'll make something that looks kind of like this. If we look at controls, I want to look at good examples. Controls. We'll do a simple version of something that looks like this, where you're like a first-person controller in a scene. And what I want to do for the second sort of like assignment for this section is to make like a little maze scene. So just working with what you've been creating so far, and maze is kind of like to be interpreted broadly here. Like it doesn't actually have to be a maze in the sense that it's hard to find your way through or it's like a puzzle, but a maze just in the sense that it's like a scene that you're going to be inside of with the controls, and you want to use the scenery to kind of like direct the user around the scene, so they have to kind of like walk around and look at stuff. That's the basic idea, is just creating like a scene with more sort of like boundaries and parameters to give somebody something to kind of walk through. So next week we'll add some controls, and that'll also give us a chance to talk about some other concepts like events. We'll be able to add some events and we'll kind of have to review a couple things like JavaScript events and probably some if statements and stuff like that. But yeah, that's what we'll work on for the second assignment for this project, and I think we'll probably spend like I don't know, another week or two on that, and then after that we can kind of decide what we want to do uh, after either continuing with Three.js stuff or moving on to another project. Okay, so let me stop recording.